This is the Cerebral Edge with Coach Chris, and we are back again with my friend Pat Marques, and we're here to talk about inflammation, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But Pat, can there be a good inflammation?
Yes, there can. Well, it's like everything else, right? I mean, everything's somewhat of a balance, right? And there's always give and take with different things. But I mean, we need inflammation to take care of injuries or illnesses that we have, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, if you get a cold or the flu, right? There's your body's your immune system's gonna start working, right? And your things are gonna get inflamed a little bit, you know, to use that term, because the body's trying to heal something, right?
Right.
So the easy kind of acute example would be, of course, like rolling your ankle, spraining your ankle, swells up, right? That's inflammation, swelling and inflammation, and that is the body and the brain trying to get to protect that area, one, by getting more fluid there, like almost like an internal cast, right? The swelling. But then to get nutrients and blood flow there and oxygen there to start dealing with the injured tissue as well. So, you know, these days when people talk about inflammation, it's a little bit with regard to like metabolic health though, right? And, kind of I guess the difference would be acute inflammation, generally a good thing that's repairing something. You've either got a sickness or you've got an injury, or chronic.
Yeah, well, even with inflammation, when you're talking about the rolled ankle, right? People always go, you got to get rid of that as quick as possible, right? So the Rice method.
Right.
So the Rice method is rest, elevate, right? Compress and ice.
Yep.
Right? So they're trying to drive that inflammation out as quick as possible. Is that good?
Not really.
No.
So even the doctor who came up with the Rice acronym, you know, years later said, yeah, I was wrong.
Really?
So, and what they found was, especially the icing part actually, is that it did not have a beneficial effect. There weren't any studies like done on all four of those things: rest, ice, compress, elevate. It's not like they did a bunch of controlled studies, you know, and then said, oh, here are the four things that are going to be great for you if you you know, if you sprain something. So they made some assumptions, obviously, and this is what science is, right? It's experimenting, and time goes on and things change. But the icing especially was actually found to be detrimental, right? Because it's reducing inflammation.
Getting rid of it.
And so before the healing process is actually, you've been kicked in and things like that. So icing, we know, is actually not good. Right, from that perspective, if we've had an acute injury. And then the rest aspect, also not really good, because we do need to be moving that area as much as we can, but in a pain-free range of motion.
Yeah.
So even if that's tiny movement of an ankle, right?
Yeah.
Little tiny circles, as long as that's pain-free, you want to be doing that to drive input back to the brain about that joint and that tissue there as much as you can.
Saying that this is safe, I can move this, and it shouldn't be painful, right?
Right. You're reducing this. So there's the actual physical threat, the torn tissues that you may have, right? Ligaments, tendons, or muscle, depending on what the injury was. And then there's the neurological threat that has, you know, that the brain now feels worried about that area because it did get injured, and that means that threat signals came from that area. So you've got to try to mitigate that by getting as much signal to that area as you can through movement and perhaps even other sensory input, a little bit of vibration, a little bit of skin stimulation by rubbing, and that kind of thing.
Taping, stuff like that.
Kinesiology taping can be very powerful in that case too, right? A little skin stretch can be a big deal.
Yeah, a lot of people, when they come to me too, especially if they've rolled their ankles a ton, I'll have them do that motion, right? Over and over, and they'll come to me with that, but I've done that a lot. I'm like, yeah, but not controlled.
Right.
And under your own power.
Exactly.
Right? So then the more they do
safely.
Yeah, and pain-free, right?
Yeah.
Because as soon as we get in pain, a lot of people will go, let's go into it, right? And it's like, no, you don't want to go quite that far, right?
Well, and you know, the perfect example of that was that I tell people is something that happened to myself when, I first, when we were both at the old Life Quest, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
the nonprofit. I was first getting into all this stuff, and I was doing a lot of ankle tilts, right? Rolling that ankle out to get some separation at that joint. And I was out running. I'm in minimalist shoes. I'm in Manitou Springs. I'm on a trail going downhill, going fast, and I roll my left ankle as soon as I hit. And it felt like the bottom of my shoe was facing my face. That's how far it felt.
Ooh.
And you know how everything goes in slow motion?
Oh.
Right? As my right foot came down, and I'm thinking to myself, this is really going to hurt, because I couldn't just stop. I was like, this is really going to hurt. And then my left foot came down, and I was like, nothing. I just kept running. So what I realized is that all those ankle tilts of opening that joint up there not only condition the tissue to have been in that very open position, but had conditioned my nervous system too, that this is okay. This is
all right.
not a big deal.
Yeah.
So yeah, it can make a big effect on that. And then if you do hurt it, getting into mobility around that joint, then that's pain-free, is then sending good signal to the brain about that.
Yeah, and then the other thing that also is a big driver for inflammation is something you're just talking about, running and exercising.
Right.
Right? And that, again, is good inflammation, correct?
Right, because we're trying to, all exercises is controlled damage in a sense, right? Stress or threat that we put the system under that we then have to recover from. Like we've talked about before, right? You don't grow from being in the gym. That is only the stimulus to grow.
Yep.
You grow when you're sleeping, right? Or when you're resting and recovering. So all exercise is inducing some level of inflammation, right? Resistance training in the muscles particularly, which is why cold plunge.
I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
I was like, what do you think about cold plunging and all this ice bath stuff that people are doing?
Great,
Yeah.
but not after you lift.
Right.
And that's what some of the studies are, fairly recent ones, are starting to show, is that it's reducing, because it reduces inflammation, which is
Quickly.
the good part about
Yeah.
things, and quickly. You don't want to do it after lifting, because that low level of good inflammation is what's
Driving your stimulus for growth, right?
hypertrophy and muscle growth, right? Yeah. So you don't want to do it right afterwards, right? At some other point in the day, and I'm not sure how long that is right now. I'm not sure what some of those studies have shown, but at a different point in time than right after training. Yeah.
But if you're playing, like, say you have like 3 games in a row, right? Say you're like an athlete, and
Right.
you have a doubleheader Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. That might be a good idea after a game, right? Because you want to recover
Right.
quick
Yeah,
before
exactly.
you go.
And that's why
train.
we've seen athletes, football players, baseball players, basketball players in ice baths since the 60s and 70s, really, right?
Yeah. Has it been that long?
I know,
Wow.
I'm old, right? but you're right, because that they've got a chronic level of inflammation going on there from long amounts of play, and so we're trying to reduce it with that. And then it has, if you do it continually, right, as part of your program, your training and things like that, and your recovery methods, then it has an overall reduction in kind of the chronic inflammation that's going on.
Yeah, so chronic inflammation. So give us a feel what chronic inflammation is. So what inflammation is. So what is that? What is the drivers for chronic inflammation?
Some of it can be nutrition. We'll probably save that for another talk, because that could be its own, really,
Could be its
in
own,
and of
yeah.
itself.
We
But
could talk hours on that.
insulin resistance and things like that can drive a lot of just chronic inflammation in the body. But high levels of just stress too can also drive that. And so if you're not exercising well and consistently, but you have a lot of work stress or other family stress, whatever it may be, right?
Yeah.
That can drive a lot of inflammation in the body as well.
So what impact, I'm going to ask you this, what impact does breath work have on that? Because that's what I notice with a lot of my clients, that they come in, especially a lot of stress, that workload stress,
Yeah.
is they get caught up into upper lobe breathing versus lower lobe breathing until I teach them how to do that. And then after I teach them how to do that, their muscles fire better, they're calmer,
Right.
they feel better, their joints feel better. What impact does breath work have to do with inflammation?
It can have a pretty large one, actually.
Yeah.
So if we think about another aspect of the body, the lymph system, right? Think of it as the sewage system of the body, right?
Right.
It's moving all the stuff out of that we need to be taken out, right? Just like a sewage system. Unlike the vascular system, lymph doesn't have a pump like the heart, right?
Right.
So the only way we move lymph is through movement. So exercise is good, right? And breathing, but proper breathing, right?
Right.
So diaphragmatic breathing is like low and horizontal vice, like you talked about, that upper lobe and chest breathing. When you're breathing vertically, upper lobe, you're actually ramping up your sympathetic side of your nervous system, the fight or flight side.
Yep.
Right? So you're certainly not doing anything to reduce chronic inflammation by getting more ramped up, right?
Right.
If we breathe low and diaphragmatic breathing, we're moving lymph better, and we're actually driving the parasympathetic rest and digest side.
Nice.
So then we can repair better, and we can have a better oxygen carbon dioxide ratio, and we are in a far more relaxed state. So we can actually perform better too, but it's going to help recover and be a guard against inflammation.
So Pat has a course that's coming out on breathing, right?
Yes.
On neuro breathing. So can you give the people out there just one tip on how to breathe better and get better breath work in? And then also, how do they get your course?
So the one tip would be, there's a lot of good things out there, but I think one of the most important things is nasal breathing, vice breathing through your mouth. Obviously, diaphragmatic breathing is very important. A lot of various aspects of breathing are important, but if you can train yourself to be, throughout the day, be breathing through the thing that's meant to breathe and has an apparatus behind it and stuff like that, that filters air, stuff like that.
Makes nitrous oxide go up too.
Nitric oxide goes out, so vasodilator, right? Blood flow moves better. You tend to, if you're a nasal breather, you tend to be more of a diaphragmatic breather too. So that would be the one thing. If you go to neurotrainingeducation.com, you can find our course on there, performance breathing, and it's what I've basically over the years found was a good sequence of teaching someone the basics of good breathing to set them up for higher and more advanced breathing skills.
Awesome. Well, this has been my talk with Coach Pat Marques on the good, the bad, and the ugly of inflammation. Yes, there is good inflammation out there, right?
There is.
And you can get him at neurotraining or neuroathlete.com, or is it Neuroathlete Cairo?
Neuroathlete Cairo.
Neuroathlete Cairo is the new one.
Yep.
And what's the number for that clinic too?
719-225-4949.
All right. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, buddy.
This has been Coach Pat Marques. Stay strong.